Hello everyone and welcome to Bash Course Quarantined U.S. History. My name is Faith and today we're going to talk about the Progressive Era. Progressives. Conservatives hate them. Why is that? While progressives generally want to change society, while conservatives usually want things to stay how they are. Since they stand for two completely opposite developments, friction is bound to arise, as it has many times. In U.S. history, we generally describe the Progressive Era as the period from around the turn of the century to World War I. This period is marked by several distinct movements hoping to accomplish social change in their own respective areas of society. Some prominent examples that we'll be discussing are the labor movement, environmental conservation, the education movement, temperance, racial equality, and women's rights. Let's start with the labor movement, one of the largest and most significant in U.S. history. With the advent of huge industry and development in the U.S., a large urban core made up of factory workers was created. The high-stakes big business economy was made up of what we might call robber barons, or titans of industry if you're not as cynical. These wealthy people, such as Andrew Carnegie and John D. Rockefeller, controlled large sections of the national economy, monopolizing whole sectors, Rockefeller for oil and Carnegie for steel. Carnegie, later in his life, wrote The Gospel of Wealth, a text which emphasized the importance of philanthropy. After making millions at the expense of others, he decided to use his millions to help others. Anyway, these robber barons were often concerned with huge profits at the expense of their workers' rights, livelihoods, and sometimes health. This led to the creation of the labor movement. Activists often held strikes, such as the Pullman Strike and the Great Railroad Strike and countless others. A noteworthy riot was the Haymarket Riot in Chicago, which quickly became the Haymarket Massacre, as police and rioters clashed after one of the rioters threw a stick of dynamite at the police. This led to a series of executions as the Chicago police force rounded up the usual suspects, labor activists, socialists, and anarchists. This was soon followed by the Homestead Strike and the Pullman Strike, where striking workers led by the American Railroad Union leader Eugene Debs fought for higher wages and were only stopped by the intervention of the Army and the jailing of Debs. In the court case In re Debs, the Supreme Court would approve of using injunctions against strikes. Debs would go on to start the American Socialist Party in 1900. The way these strikes were organized was through unions. These were organizations of workers who used collective bargaining to try to barter for better worker conditions, such as shorter workdays, more pay, and more benefits. Many of these were nationwide, including the National Labor Union of 1866, which secured the 8-hour workday, the Knights of Labor, who began as a secret society, and the American Federation of Labor in 1886, which was a joining of 25 different craft unions. Across the country, whole industries could be shut down with very little notice, making them very dangerous to robber barons. That's why many employers worked into employee contracts that employees couldn't be members of unions, or only certain ones. Now, we referenced monopolies earlier, but we didn't really go into detail. To many, monopolies were also known as trusts. For instance, after the financial panic of 1893, the railroad system essentially became an enormous monopoly under J.P. Morgan. Many in politics sought to eliminate these trusts as they were the exact opposite of true competition, upon which, as Americans, we pride ourselves. One of these politicians, John Sherman, proposed an act to outlaw the trusts that plagued America at the time, which were essentially unregulated. This was passed as the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890. Woodrow Wilson would later strengthen this law with the Clayton Antitrust Act of 1914 and the Federal Trade Commission to investigate business practices. However, problems did not only lie with industrial factory workers. Farmers were suffering as well. With overproduction, low prices, and rising costs and taxes, they were stuck in perpetual debt. They organized the National Grange Movement to advocate for themselves economically and politically, with cooperatives to lobby state legislatures and try to get fairer rates out of the railroad monopolies. Their efforts led to the 1886 Interstate Commerce Act, which established the Interstate Commerce Commission, or ICC, to regulate the railroads. Farmers' alliances also developed, as well as a national alliance, which met in Ocala, Florida, and developed the Ocala Platform, which would form the basis of the populist movement and later political reforms. Farm problems would start to be addressed nationally under Wilson, with the passage of the 1916 Federal Farm Loan Act. This act was coupled with the Child Labor Act of 1916 to prevent products being sold across state lines that were produced by anyone under the age of 14. Unfortunately, this act was declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court in the 1918 Hammer v. Dagenhart case. One president, Theodore Roosevelt, determinedly sought to continue to fix the labor issue. One of his main policies was the square deal, which basically meant solving issues by making sure the deal was square with each of the parties, bringing together unions and employers to resolve conflict. Roosevelt wasn't just an important figure in labor, however. He was also a very prominent advocate for conservation. He was seen by many as an outdoorsman, and he probably shared that opinion. He used his time as president to further preserve the natural world, passing the Newlands Reclamation Act to generate income for irrigation projects, as well as establishing the National Conservation Commission under Gifford Pinchot, and setting aside huge tracts of land for preservation. However, this movement had existed long before Roosevelt. In the late 1800s, many national parks were created, including Yosemite and Yellowstone, and the Forest Reserve Act and Forest Management Act of 1891 and 1897, respectively, were passed. Additionally, notable preservationist John Muir founded the Sierra Club in 1892 to protect nature from human destruction. After Roosevelt, President Taft would continue this trend by creating the Bureau of Mines and the Preserving National Forest Reserves. Another movement which saw enormous results because of its organization and drive was temperance, going back as far as 1826 with the founding of the mostly Protestant group, the American Temperance Society. This movement would culminate in the 18th Amendment, Prohibition. In 1874, the Women's Christian Temperance Union was founded, followed by the Anti-Saloon League in 1893. Education was also sorely in need of reform. An activist named Horace Mann advocated for free public schools in the early 1800s. Higher education would be pushed forward as well, with land grants, openings for women, and reformers such as W.E.B. Du Bois advocating for integration and equal educational opportunity for African Americans. There were also less well-defined movements for social change. In the early 1800s, utopian thinkers tried to create ideal societies to improve upon the ills they saw in mainstream culture, such as the community of Brook Farm and others. This went hand in hand with the philosophical movement of transcendentalism, which held idealized views of divinity and community living. Another early movement for social change was the American Peace Society in 1828, whose purpose is pretty much self-explanatory, as well as the movement for asylum reform directed by Dorothea Dix. Later, social movements would include support for immigrants and the poor through settlement houses, such as Jane Addams's Hull House in Chicago. Broader changes, such as the introduction of the social gospel, expanded the role of religion to include a duty to support the needy in society. The founding of Christian Science and the Salvation Army both contributed to the era of the social gospel. Speaking of broad movements, there was much political reform that occurred in the 1800s and early 1900s. Before we even got to the Progressive Era, that is to say, during the Gilded Age, we had the rise of the third party, the Populist Party, who grew out of the political power of the farmers' alliances. Their platform for reform was known as the Omaha Platform, and included direct election of senators, initiatives and referendums, free silver, a graduated income tax, railroads becoming publicly owned, a government telegraph system, farmer loans, and an 8-hour workday for factory workers. This party was a key cause of the Progressive Era. Another cause of the rise of the political reform of the 20th century was the muckrakers, journalists who wrote exposés of bad practices in multiple industries. One important muckraker who could easily be grouped into the labor movement was Upton Sinclair, an author and journalist who's best known for his 1906 work The Jungle, a novel based on his time working undercover in Chicago's meatpacking plants. This work was initially intended to push for improved workers' rights and health, but its greatest effect was tightening food safety restrictions on the food industry, with the creation of the FDA through the Pure Food and Drug Act and Meat Inspection Act of 1906. He didn't only write about meatpacking, though. He also wrote about workers' rights issues in the coal mines with his 1917 novel King Coal, and he even wrote about the issue of yellow journalism in reporting in The Brass Check, published in 1919. Yellow journalism was a huge issue at that time. If you're not familiar with it, it's basically the practice of exaggerating events in reporting to attract more customers. One major outcome of this style was actually the Spanish-American War. Many reporters depicted Spanish forces in Latin America as brutal oppressors. The flashy headlines and advertising led to many Americans calling for war, which was only aided by the fact that the USS Maine exploded in Cuba, which was obviously attributed to Spanish attack or sabotage by the rampant forces of yellow journalism. Two prominent practitioners of this style of reporting were Joseph Pulitzer and William Randolph Hearst. Upton Sinclair, with the Brass Check, was attempting to bring these improper practices to light. Jacob Riis was another muckraker whose photography and writing about the poverty and slums that were the New York City tenements were hugely influential in his book, How the Other Half Lives. A muckraker named Lincoln Steffens also exposed New York, but this time for the corruption of its political machines through his novel The Shame of the Cities. Ida Tarbell was another, who concentrated on exposing the unfair practices of the Standard Oil Trust. Social activist Florence Kelley would also lobby determinedly for protection for women and children, including schools, juvenile courts, divorce reform, safety regulations, and parole laws for children, etc. Her efforts and those of other reformers, including Jane Addams, culminated in the National Child Labor Committee, which proposed regulatory laws, and the National Consumer League, headed by Kelley, to protect women. However, more work was still needed, as was made evident by the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire of 1911, where 146 people died, mostly young women. Political reform on the state level included secret ballots, direct election of senators, and the initiative, referendum, and recall ideas to have more popular participation in lawmaking. These state-level ideas would eventually find a more national footing through the passage of the 17th Amendment, which provided for direct election of senators. During the time of Teddy Roosevelt's Square Deal, he was also taking steps in railroad regulation, passing the Elkins Act of 1903 and the Hepburn Act of 1906 to stop railroad rebates and fix rates, respectively. The program of progressive political reform would continue under Taft, the Mann-Elkins Act, which gave the ICC the authority to suspend railroad rates, and the 16th Amendment, which gave the national government the right to collect an income tax. However, Taft was seen as anti-progressive when he signed the Payne-Aldrich Tariff into law in 1909 and supported conservatives in positions of power, such as Speaker of the House Joe Cannon or Ballinger in the Pinchot-Ballinger controversy. Due to the split in the Republican Party due to Roosevelt's dissatisfaction with Taft's policies and subsequent creation of the Bull Moose Party, also known as the New Progressive Party, as well as the creation of the Socialist Party led by Eugene Debs in 1901, a Democrat named Woodrow Wilson was able to win the presidency, even though he didn't have the majority of the votes. He did, however, have the full force of the United Democratic Party backing him, unlike Taft and Roosevelt. Wilson was a hardcore Democrat and thus believed in small government. One of his policies, New Freedom, embodied this. This program emphasized smaller federal reach and renewed business competition after the decades of trusts and monopolies of his predecessors. He also passed the Underwood Tariff of 1913, which established a federal income tax on the wealthier people and a corporate tax, while also reducing tariffs on many goods. The Federal Reserve Act, in a surprise twist for Wilson, established a national bank with government control. Another movement which had been fighting hard for a very, very long time was a movement for racial equality. Unfortunately, this movement, despite the Civil War and the Emancipation Proclamation, and the 13th and 14th and 15th Amendments, would not see real progress until the 1960s Civil Rights Movement. This movement began with activists such as Underground Railroad conductor Harriet Tubman, writer and former slave Frederick Douglass, and successful orator and escaped slave Sojourner Truth, who delivered her famous speech, Ain't I a Woman, at an 1851 Women's Rights Convention. Around this time, the American Colonization Society was formed for establishing a freed slave population in Africa, and the American Anti-Slavery Society, led by the radical William Lloyd Garrison, were formed, as well as the Liberty Party for advancement through political influence. Later, after many rulings such as Plessy v. Ferguson, legitimizing segregation through the separate but equal idea, activists such as W.E.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington developed different strategies for securing equality. While Washington wanted economic power, Du Bois thought civil rights were necessary first and foremost. Ida B. Wells was another muckraker who exposed the violence and the lynchings in the South after the Civil War. Du Bois and other intellectuals formed the Niagara Movement and then the NAACP. Additionally, the National Urban League was founded to give aid in the Great Migration. So let's talk about the last movement we have to cover, women's rights. This movement started in the mid-1800s, but didn't see success until women got the vote in 1920 with the 19th Amendment. In 1848, activists Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton held the Seneca Falls Convention for Women's Rights, where the Declaration of Sentiments was written. In the style of the Declaration of Independence, it asserted the fundamental rights of women. Another reformer who was soon at the forefront of the campaign for the electoral franchise, along with Stanton, was Susan B. Anthony. Both served as presidents of the new organization NAWSA, the National American Women's Suffrage Association. Later, this movement would be revitalized by a younger, more militant leader, Alice Paul. Splitting from NAWSA to form the National Women's Party, or NWP, she led pickets of the White House and hunger strikes to force policymakers into action. However, it was only after the distraction of World War I had occurred that her efforts came to fruition. She also penned the Equal Rights Amendment, or ERA, to secure pure equality for women. This still has not gone into effect today. Thanks for watching Bash Course Quarantined U.S. History, and we'll see you next time. Stay out of school, kids. The Bash Course Quarantine team is Sandro Ansari, Sam Mencimer, Eamon Cole, Pasha Ishaq, Sarah Orozco, and myself. Please put any questions you may have in the comments below, and we'll do our best to answer them or find someone who can. Thank you for watching Bash Course, and as they say in my hometown, oh my EOSH.